Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of the Junto podcast. For many of you who have been day one listeners, you will recognize some of these incredible OG faces on tonight's pod. This is the first pod we've ever done virtually, thanks to Riverside FM. Incredible piece of tech. If you haven't seen it, I thoroughly recommend you check it out. And shout out to the All In podcast. Shout out to Jay Cal, David Sachs, Shamarth, David Freeberg. I think this is a super compelling format, and I wanted to convene some of the best minds that I know, many of the minds that started this community. And we thought we'd give it a spin tonight, our own edition of the All In Pod. So I'm going to start with some intros. First, we've got the Liberty Bill lover, the Cuban prince, annihilator of the algorithm, and king of YouTube, Mr. Mateo. Can we circle back on that price? Apologies in advance for Mateo's audio, but Mateo, how are you, my friend? Welcome to the show.
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Next, we've got the French professor, student holdings Hall of Famer, the wickedest wildcat, the doctor of the deck, Tim Ferriss fanboy, Mr. Amaan, I only drink tea, Bedrudin. Amaan, how is New York City, my friend?
It's doing great. Not as good as that intro, though.
Okay, fantastic. Finally, we last but not least, the Rust Belt Rude Boy, Ohio debate champion, crypto connoisseur, the Twitter sphere's whisperer, Drake's deputy, Jihad OVO Eshmael. Jihad, how are you, my guy?
Oh man, can we just do a full podcast of intros? Just like go down your Rolodex. I want to hear an intro for every single person.
Yeah, how long did that take for you to make?
It actually only took me 5 minutes because I just love you guys, and thesaurus.com was definitely utilized, but I just tried to take some of the unique things about you. So I take it that those intros were good. So maybe I'll continue, and for the next episode we can add on Rubino. But yeah, guys, welcome. Thank you for taking part of your evenings to get this done. We're going to follow a pretty simple format tonight for everyone listening at home. We're going to kind of dissect 4 topics, each of which has been kind of chosen by the members of the group, and we're going to kick it for 15-20 minutes on the topic and then switch. This should kind of reflect the kind of coffee style, beer style, dinner style meetings we would have. So with that, we'll get into it. Amaan, we're going to begin with you. The topic you selected for tonight was student loans. Could you give the audience at home a feeling for why you selected this, and let's get into your deepest and darkest thoughts on this hell of a topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the student loan forgiveness has been kind of a big topic for the last several years, but also very recently with Biden signing, I think, the executive order. And I was curious to get your guys' thoughts because one, like I know we've talked a little bit about ROI of college and school, and I always feel like that's a super interesting topic. And then obviously for me, as I kind of move into that space, it's something that I'm very curious about. And so like just super high level. So, I think it's about $1.6 trillion of student debt in the US. About 30% of that is going to be forgiven. So in some sense, fantastic, right? Because that's so much debt that's overhanging so many people, millions and millions of people in the U.S. And typically a lot of the folks that are, either underrepresented and have, not these massive incomes that can support the debt repayment. So a lot of that debt would either have continued to kind of accumulate for decades, or just never get repaid at all. So in some sense, it's great. That's also like $400+ billion that is now no longer coming to the government. Taxes and stuff. Obviously, that's gonna hurt somebody somewhere, one way or another. But I'm also kind of curious to think about how you guys think about where the conversation of ROI of college is going to change, and how you guys think about where do you think does this mean tuition is going to keep going up? Do you think that this is a one-time solution, or is this something that potentially will continue and kind of in different shapes and forms? So kind of open-ended to start, but I guess I'll open it up. Like, what do you guys think about, what was passed, trade-offs, challenges, the future of it?
Yeah, man, I think it's a fascinating topic. I'll try and be brief. I know I'm not brief, so just, log off if I talk for the whole podcast. I think a couple of things. I think number one, the cost of tuition increasing, I think is inexplicable. I think if you track the number of administrators that have been added to, universities, that's basically driving 100% of the cost, call it 90. I don't want to do public math tonight. And so I think there's a real question of value, right? Like if any of us were charging for a product and every year we decided to raise it 3, 5, 10, 15%, and materially it was the same good, usually a consumer, right, would just say, I'm either opting out or you're going to have to explain, this increase to me. There is an element, especially among the elite universities, you could argue they have a bit of a monopoly on the market. Obviously, they aren't only single providers, but there's only one Northwestern, right? There's only one Notre Dame. So I think that's one kind of topic is, the friction I feel is around where's the value, what's justifying these costs. Second then comes around ROI, right? We live in a generation where people now make millions of dollars playing Call of Duty. I was born in 1995. When I grew up playing Xbox, mothers and fathers were like, get off those machines and get outside and play in the woods. Now I go to bed every night watching Jono Opnir win the F1 esports championships. So just the non-traditional nature of, I think, economic growth and prosperity is kind of like basically at large with this idea of come and get a 4-year degree or a graduate degree and, your life will be solved. The third is student loans. I personally have student loans. They're private, so they won't be forgiven. I'm friends and obviously close to lots of people with student loans. And I just think it's absurd that these people are taking out loans which literally cannot be forgiven. Even if you die, you have a co-signer. So it goes to your family or somebody else. It just seems absolutely ludicrous. And so that's kind of my against argument. My for argument is interesting, right? So like being a British citizen, actually there are less students in the US, despite the drastically different cost of education, in debt as a percentage of the population than the UK. So like in the UK, you only start paying your loans back if you make more than like £23,000 a year or something like that. We'll put up a statistic after this in the post-production. And so 76% of students in the UK don't end up paying back their loans, even though it's only £9,000 a year. So there is an argument, right, that like making something more expensive, in theory, doesn't make it harder to pay back if you can give them that increase in the cost of earnings. And I think the UK is a very interesting data point, which is university's cheap and people still find it very difficult to kind of pay it back. So I'd love to kind of see a better statistic based on median income. I would love to see there to be other ways in which students could kind of get their loans forgiven. I would love to see more employers stepping into the fray and paying for student loan forgiveness as opposed to pet insurance for their employees. So I think it's a huge topic. It's a hairy topic. Obviously, it's a great source of income for the government. And I think we should mention that just because these loans are forgiven doesn't mean people won't pay anything. I mean, a lot of times people can go broke by just paying the tax bill on their student loans. So the government still is going to be receiving some type of income. It just won't be as large as before. And I do think that's a good thing because I hope that people use that money to take new risk, start new lives, do things that they haven't done before. But at the end of the day, you signed on the dotted line. So as you can see from my headspace, I don't have a definitive argument on this. I'm not, for or against. I think there are merits on both sides, but those are some of the things I've kind of been reacting to, and I would love to hear the rest of the group's input.
There's this interesting relationship between the cost of education and the debt that comes from education that you highlight, Cornelius. Like, for example, you can imagine a world, and I'm sure the statistics point to this happening currently, where like as the price of college tuition rises, more and more students are going in the direction of college majors that like would theoretically be able to pay more so that they could like repay those loans, right? So I would be curious to see like whether or not that same trend is occurring in the UK, or whether because the price is generally lower, folks are more interested in just studying what they are interested in versus what they think is going to get the correct ROI. At the same time, though, like you can imagine a world where the government not only has a incentive to like forgive student loans for whatever economic reasons, but also um, if those loans are going to continue to rack up, that the government does not have an incentive to fund certain programs that are not going to lead to like economic ROI that's going to like replenish the tax base. So for example, my hometown university just announced that in the next 5 years they're going to be defunding a few of like the liberal arts programs, despite the fact that they were some of the most popular at the university because they ended up having the lowest ROI of graduates, right? As far as like incomes that they got after graduation. So all of these things are definitely interrelated, but I'm curious, and Amaan, I'm sure you like just given the research that you've done on the topic, have some more context there as to like in what ways some of these variables are impacting each other.
Is the only metric of ROI income? Feels backwards. Like, it's definitely a great metric, but just like satisfaction of the individual feels like a pretty simple secondary metric that you could study pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point because I don't think you have to have like income has to be the only one, but I do think maybe a slightly better metric would be like ability to repay the loan, right? Because there's an element there of income, but you know, after a certain threshold, like that's not really what you should be optimizing society around necessarily. But at the same time, like if you can't repay the loan, and it's not because like, oh, like, you know, you should be doing it because the government, you know, we should be paying more to the government. That's not the point. But if the population can't support the cost of this tuition, and it's an interesting point because I actually hadn't heard. I've talked to a lot of different like directors of financial aid over the last like couple months for work stuff, and I hadn't heard too much of like trying to steer students in any way in terms of like which, you know, majors, and I, you know, I think to some extent you want, like as a university, you want to preserve like the like academic integrity and the values, but at the same time, like I don't know, at least when I talk to like friends and family members, I feel like it's always a conversation around like an awareness, at least not necessarily a direct like, oh, you should be a petroleum engineer, but it's like, you know, well, how do you think about your career aspects or your career ambitions and what you can make at and kind of how you can kind of support yourself. The other thing that I've heard of a little bit more as this stuff has kind of come out and more people have dug into it is, you know, is there any responsibility on the part of the university? Because there's definitely a responsibility on the part of the university to help navigate and help students navigate kind of their career kind of pathways and how to think about, you know, how to spend their time in college to maximize the ROI, however they define that ROI metric. But I also feel like right now, like, you know, not only is there not a whole lot of tools and like, you know, sufficient guided pathways to understand your loan information, how to think about repayments, how to think about like your career. Like there isn't like a, you know, a nice package around that, but there's even less of like an explicit, like here's, you know, from our university, here's how our graduates fare across these different programs, right? Like you might have a slide with different logos of different companies, but you don't really have a good understanding of, and it's something that I did incessantly, like prior to going to school, which was like, you know, what are the different income quintiles of different majors at all these different schools? And sure, maybe not everybody does that, but it helped me to think about like, okay, like, you know, what is the future kind of, what might it hold? And you know, it probably factored into why I chose engineering as opposed to other, you know, disciplines.
I think also given that at least my alma mater, and I'm not sure about your guys's because I don't think they manage their money as well, but
Wait, what?
They they I was just waiting for a reaction there, guys. Geez, it's supposed to be fun. Um,
They did have like a 50% return in one of the recent years. They jumped up to like a $20 billion endowment.
That's chump change, according to Cornelius.
I just expected more from the Wildcats.
You say it as if you like had a role to play in it, you know?
No, I just say it with great pride. Anyway, I think the interesting thing is that my alma mater is in a position where it can literally afford to pay for everybody's tuition. So it seems ridiculous, right, that in a world where the university could easily absorb tuition costs, and I'm not saying 100%, but let's assume you could assume most of the debt that people are taking on. That's a really interesting idea. I had financial aid at school. I'm not sure about you guys. Campus employment was part of my financial aid package. You could very much see a world where every dollar earned, there was another dollar that went to the student loan. But at the end of the day, right, a lot of these loans are private, and there's big interest rates, and they're obviously going to kind of continue to spike. So I think that's kind of one thing. I personally don't buy the major argument. I think that's destructive. I understand why the universities aren't going for that, because ultimately they have to keep every department happy. I believe in the idea of holistic education. And actually, I don't believe that your earning potential has anything to do with your major. I think a major is a lagging indicator for a type of person or a type of skill set. And so I think a better conversation is, what are the skills you actually need in this world to earn outsized money relative to the people that you went to school with? And I think this group is a great example of that. So it's less about the philosopher who doesn't make anything, because there are tons of philosophers that are billionaires. I think it's more about, how does the university support people who may find it hard to earn an adequate income after they graduate? And this has kind of been referred to as open loop, closed loop education. And I think that's obviously a space I'm playing in professionally. But I think making money is a skill. Has nothing to do with what you studied. Absolutely everything to do with how you know how to make money. And that isn't taught at the university level.
It's definitely not taught, but there are definitely a wide variety of factors that go into that skill building outside of just what you were taught at university or some formal schooling. Like demographic and upbringing, I'm sure have a much larger role in that than where you went to university. And like you said, as a result, where you went to university is often a lagging indicator. But I think you need to know your student body, and you need to know the students that you were working with, right? The type of student that goes to a Northwestern or a Notre Dame has already proven that they are ambitious in some category or another. And therefore, they can go major in philosophy and still become a billionaire, theoretically, right? At the same time, though, some of the smaller public universities with higher acceptance rates are not attracting as ambitious of students, or students who have proven those skills prior to enrolling at university. And you need to know your student body and know that those are the types of students that are going to need some sort of formal education, whether it's a major that is going to point them in the direction of a job that is going to make more money, or some pathway that is going to lead them on a better path than, the point being that it's dependent on the student, not just the major, right? So I think the university does have a responsibility to identify who the students at the university are.
100%. And the book I'd recommend, maybe as we wrap here, is The Years That Matter by Paul Tough. Phenomenal book. I think Paul went to Princeton. But he basically looks at the ROI of college for basically different kids from different income backgrounds. And obviously the most drastic impact of an Ivy League education is for the kids that come in from the lowest education level. But obviously there's so few of them that actually make it to that level that net, it's not actually that valuable. The middle class do okay. The upper class basically earn what they would have done anyway. High level analysis, obviously not reading the book. So yeah, I'm with you, Jay. But I just think this idea of being shackled to something and paying for something, and I think there is a bit of an issue I have, especially with the private institutions that are non-profits, which is, these guys don't pay taxes, right? So it is a really interesting idea that like you have a monopoly that's a non-profit that can afford to pay for you to go somewhere, but somehow you still end up paying them out the arse. It just doesn't feel right. And I'm not opposed to paying them, but like, could I pay them in different ways? You know, could I come back for 10 years on campus and contribute in some way, either my time or my resources? Like, I think there are probably interesting economic models that could kind of work there. And it would allow people to do different things. You know, and again, I think when I went to school and I was deciding to go to school, like it was 2012. It was not 2022, 2023. So I think this is going to become more of a pernicious problem. And I take your point that for the smaller universities, it's definitely something to figure out. You know, for the big guns, maybe not as bad, but I can't believe they like generating students that are in debt. It's not good for anybody. You know, just makes you think you got less of a deal than you did the years that go on.
I was chatting with our school president at Northwestern like 4 years ago, and he told me that if someone donated, I think like 1.5 or $2 billion, they would just make tuition free. And his hypothesis was that somebody in the next like decade or two, hey Jay, I'm just telling you what I was told. His hypothesis is someone's going to do that, and then once one school does it, all the others are going to have to like start to follow suit or not raise tuition every single year. So imagine if Bezos just spent half the money on that rocket space launch for 4 minutes, and you could just fund a school's tuition forever. It's fascinating.
Well, you're taking that statement at face value. And also, you could also make the argument that, well, Northwestern's endowment is what? They definitely have a significant amount of money. That's why, I mean, for example, Notre Dame has not made tuition free, but what they've done is they have, and what I think I could see happening with some of these other, like, and when I say some, I'm talking like 10, maybe 20 institutions in the US, which is kind of what they have it. I think there's a few schools that have this now, where it's like, we're going to meet whatever the financial need is. So after your Pell Grant, after whatever guaranteed grants that you've gotten, we will then meet the delta between, you know, what your financial need is and the cost of attendance. And I can see more schools doing that.
Okay, so next was side hustles. I'm going to make a very brief intro here, but Adam Grant, who I don't love, I think he's a bit overrated, tweeted yesterday that side hustles can improve your performance at work, which to me is what Twitter is for, you know, things that sound good but don't really work in reality. I can see Jihad grimacing as I say that. But anyway, I just wanted to debate that with you. I was just at drinks earlier today with 3 kind of digital nomads, all working pretty peculiar asynchronous hours, traveling completely full time. And yeah, I think like what's so interesting to me and maybe connected to this first point is like, is someone's ability to get out of the debt they're in based on how many income streams they have. And I think having a second income stream is such a valuable thing because it almost detaches you from this idea that like a job is the only way you can get paid in life and like exist. And so, yeah, I like to hear that Adam Grant is not encouraging employers to get their employees to take up side hustles, but like recognizing the benefits. And, you know, I find it very difficult to imagine an employer being like, yeah, here's all this money, go do it. But I know we all know people on this phone call, maybe looking at one of you more than the other, who have struck very interesting advisory relationships with some pretty big people. And it's very clear that they are side hustling, but basically getting paid to side hustle. So we know this is a thing. I don't know how like mass market it is, but I encourage it. And I remember when I got paid my first dollar outside of a W-2, it's electric. I always think everybody should feel that feeling. So just curious for everybody's take on this. Do we think this is real? Is this just an Adam Grant fancies a bunch of retweets? Could any of you imagine running a business where you encouraged your people to literally spend their time on other things? I think this is meaty and, you know, again, a really good topic to discuss.
What are we defining as like a side hustle versus a passion? Like, I love photography. Like, do I need to be making money for it to be a side hustle? Like, I love photography versus like consulting for random people. Like, what's the definition?
I mean, I don't know what the definition is in the paper. My definition would be it's something you're doing outside of work that is paying you something. So I don't see it as, oh, I have an Instagram. You could be working at Joe Losco for all I care. You know, that is a side hustle. It is not your primary form of income.
Yeah, it's interesting because have you guys seen this Reddit community called Overemployed?
Yeah, no, I've seen it.
No. What is this?
Wild, absolutely wild.
I've read about this. Yeah.
The first time I heard about it, I was actually like, I was a little bit, I almost took like offense to it because the idea is you have these people that take on multiple jobs. And that in itself is not a bad thing. And for some people, obviously, like you said, if that's what you need to do to meet, pay your bills, it's unfortunate, but like it's awesome to see like the ingenuity that people can and obviously like dedication that people take on. And you can reference any number of immigrant stories that relied on multiple streams of income to make ends meet. And I think that's wonderful. But the way that I came into like contact with this Reddit thread, or like the one that I had seen for the first time, it was essentially like this software engineer that was working 4 different jobs, making like 650K, not like doesn't need to, and just like very purposefully saying like I am making a sucker out of all of my employers, right? Like they love me. I work 5 hours a week. I'm working 30 hours across my 4 jobs, making a hand over fist. And that I was like, okay, that seems disingenuous. Now, at the same time, if you're doing good for the employer and the employers actually like you, okay, I can. But it was always like it's all these tips about like how do you fool your manager? How do you what do you do when you have like multiple people, multiple meetings at the same time? Like how do you what do you do to make sure to get rid of all that stuff? And so that's why like I didn't love it. In general, I think the side hustles thing, like when at my previous job, when I had people on my team, one of them like had made it clear that she had a side hustle going on, like when she, before she came and while she was, working on my team as well. To me, I encouraged it. One, because like it wasn't direct competition. Two, like she obviously really liked it and she was like a good person. And I frankly just like wanted to recruit her and I wanted to retain her. And so, unfortunately, like we were super busy. And so like that probably impacted her ability to kind of, the frequency with which that she could kind of engage in the side hustle. But to me, I think there's almost something for me, and this may be the case for all of us when you're looking for candidates. I want to see somebody that exhibits the ambition, exhibits like they don't just see, the 9 to 5 as like that's their end all be all, and it doesn't have to be paid necessarily, but it's something, and it definitely doesn't have to be paid in fact, but it demonstrates that like, hey, like I don't just spend my free time just kind of like on the couch watching TV, unless that's your side hustle and you find a way to like make that like something that you're practicing and like developing and you're really like engaged in it, right? So to me, like I'm for it, but obviously like with the standard like disclaimers around like, okay, like you should be smart about how you're prioritizing it.
Yeah, I think Amaan, like, I'm pulling up this overemployed thread, and like, this is hilarious. Laid off from the greatest J1 of all time. Sad as hell. It was the ultimate overemployed job. Maybe 3 hours of work a week. My craziest week was 6 hours of work a year ago. What an exhausting time. Once every 3 months, I'd have to take on more work. My boss would always tell me, no, just stay focused on your tasks. I don't want you overwhelmed. 6-figure salary, full benefits. Last year, I spent 2 weeks in Cancun, drunk day and night. She gave me a raise. God, I miss her. I fucking love you, Stacy. Yeah. So, like, it's funny, right? Like, that's actually an underemployment story. It's not an overemployment story. So I agree. I am a big believer in this idea of bullshit jobs. Like, I've got no idea what like 90% of my friends fucking do. No fucking idea. Haven't heard a peep out of them in years. Don't know how they're paid what they're paid. So I'm totally with you, Amaan. If people choose to spend 20, 30 hours a week on the couch, working out, training for a marathon, how suddenly that you're like deciding to, donate that time to something else, is that kind of like seen as a bad thing? That said, as someone that has balanced side hustles, I totally know what it feels like to kind of over involve yourself and over employ yourself. And I actually think it's a good thing because there's a market correction, right? You can miss a deliverable, you can fuck someone off, you can do bad work. I think that's a really valuable lesson to learn. But ultimately, like, the tough part about side hustles is you don't get raises because of them. Like, that's the thing I ran into, is I was getting all of this amazing experience through my side hustles that probably netted me several promotions at work. But because it didn't come from work, it wasn't seen as that. However, if I had been hired externally with that same experience, I would have come in at a big level. So I think this promotes just a bigger topic, which is like W-2 employment is absolutely bullshit. I can't believe we haven't innovated beyond it. And it's in these moments with recessions where people are getting laid off that we're actually thinking about new labor force models. And I still can't believe that, like, that's how most people earn their money. It just seems absolutely ludicrous to me. So thank you for the Reddit thread. I think this is terrific. I've heard the stories of, one AirPods, one company, the other AirPods, the other company, and then the Zoom call on mute is the third business. And it's fantastic.
I will say, I think we both started from a similar premise, but I think we arrived at different conclusions. So I'll let the others chime in as well. But I'm not sure. There was a couple pieces at the end there. I was like, this could be a podcast in and of itself.
Wait, highlight those pieces before I chime in. What specifically do you feel you disagree on?
I'm not as surprised that so many people have W-2 jobs. I'm not so surprised. Like, to me, typically in a recession and a downturn, it's gig workers, a lot of, like, there's all kinds of, like, those are typically much easier to be laid off, and, like, there's, you have less benefits and you have less, like, there's a reason why I think a lot of people at least are, they look to get a W-2, they look to, have an employer to provide different coverage and different, security. And obviously it's been demonstrated that those jobs are not as secure as anybody thinks or anybody used to think that they are. But I'm not sure that, at least I don't know what the better alternative is, and what the better deal is for the employee. But I probably haven't, looked into it and had as much skin in the game as you either.
So I think a couple of things. The first is overemployment as a subreddit is hilarious. My favorite story was this guy was using Slack, or he was using Discord at work, but his Slack notifications went off while he was on a Zoom call. And his boss DM'd him and was like, "Why do you have Slack downloaded on your computer? We don't use Slack at this company." And like everybody was like, "Deny, you didn't hear the Slack notification." Like, just it's a very, I agree with Amaan. Not that I don't think overemployment should exist, just that like the disingenuousness of it all, and like the fact that you're like blatantly lying to your employer definitely feels weird. I will say though that like, for a lot of the companies that I have exposure to on a regular basis, folks are working 2 or even 3 jobs across companies in the industry. Part of that being that like there are so few people with the domain expertise to do the job well. So companies are okay with like this more like flexible employment style where we're going to hire like one person to work at like 2 different companies so long as they're non-competing, because they just there's a supply shortage there. I think the second thing though that I find really interesting is like, once you get into this habit of like, okay, we are implementing this norm out of necessity that we are going to hire people who are also working at another company publicly, you realize that productivity is at the level that you want it to be, and people are still going like above and beyond for the company despite the fact that they have these 2 different jobs, because oftentimes the roles can be complementary, right? If I'm doing biz dev at 2 different companies and they have non-competing products, but they exist in the same industry, the fact that I'm building customer relationships for one company could potentially be beneficial for the other company as well, because you might be you're working with the same customer base. As a result, we've seen a lot more companies in the industry actually like promote the fact for certain roles, like biz dev being one of them, that they want to see people like working in various organizations part-time or encourage that to some degree. Obviously, that doesn't work well for every company, but I think in smaller industries like crypto, where folks are, with it, like the customer base isn't as large and the supply is much smaller, like it could work very well.
Yeah, I think great points, Jay. I'd like to kind of double click and maybe save this for another pod too, but just, but think of it this way, right? If I'm that good and I'm two people's jobs, have you ever heard of people getting paid double the salary? So like, I don't feel bad. Is your employer 100% honest with you? No. So I think that's kind of the balance, is like, if people are talented, they should take the opportunities that they need. It's a bit like playing for your club and paying for your country. And employers, if they want somebody to not have two jobs, should pay them double the fee. But of course, a business isn't going to do that, and I don't know why. And I think it's this entrepreneurial obsession with like having employees. And I
was just going to say, it's also like, why would a business do that? Like, as a business owner, right? Like, if I know that you can go out and get another job behind my back, right? And it might, as long as you're doing it to the point where I do not see an impact on performance, but I'm not like explicitly outlawing it in the contract or whatever it might be, why would I pay you more? Even though I might prefer the fact that like you are like 100% dedicated to the company, it doesn't make economic sense for me to pay you like $300,000 as opposed to $150,000 just because I don't want you to go work for another company, because you might still go work for another company. So I think,
yeah, but this is the thing, right? So this gets into like the existential piece of the argument, which is time-based value versus just value. So like, what I'm saying is, if you were working at a business and there was a useless fucker on your team who was getting paid similar to you, right? You should be able to say, look, I can do two people's jobs, get rid of that person. That is never, ever, ever, ever going to happen. Even in America, right? The land of at-will employment. It's just never going to happen. If you're 2 times as good at your job than everybody else, you're never going to get paid double. That's a problem. If you look at sports, that doesn't happen, right? Lionel Messi is very different from basically every other striker. And then there's kind of cascading down. So like, that's one argument. Second, like, value is not based on time. It's not. It's based on results. So if I pay you $300,000 and you're able to then generate X return, amazing, right? That's super wise. But also, if we're getting to the diminishing marginal return point, then does it matter that you have a side hustle or not? No. And like, what do you owe these guys? I think that's what people are realizing, is like, we now live in a world where you can basically get paid to do anything, like in any way, in any shape, in any form, right? Like that way of earning has become totally decentralized. And so I want people to explore that. And I don't think it's being disingenuous, right? Like, I really, really don't. And if employers find out you're working a second job, you've got 2 decisions. You can pay them more and say, hey, we want this ROI, or you can just let them do what they were doing because you didn't know any better. So I don't buy this performance thing, and I don't buy that your manager should be telling you how to perform, because typically managers actually step out of the role of actually doing the job. And Jihad, as you beautifully pointed out, there are a lot of industries now where like being old probably suggests that you're worse at something, right? Social media was probably the first version of this, crypto probably the second. And what you're suggesting is that these economies, these industries, are starting to become a larger part of like day-to-day work. So I don't think it's disingenuous. I think people should feel free to maximize their earning potential, because who's an employer to tell you how to live your life? If you can work 3 jobs for the next 4 years and then peace out, all power to you, mate. All power to you. So I'm obviously super, I don't know if it's liberal on this, but like, work fundamentally, that's what it is. It's just it's a unit of a way of getting paid. I think people get too in love, and you see all these TikToks, right, of all these tech people, day at LinkedIn, I went for my foot rub, and then we had sushi. Yeah, then we had sushi.
What TikTok are you on?
You haven't seen this, Mateo?
Never seen that.
So this woman, I'll put it up on. Dude, she got in huge trouble. Like, she did a TikTok of like her day at LinkedIn, and the tweet just blew up. People are like, "What the? Never met anybody at LinkedIn that's done a real day of work in their life." Dude, hilarious. HR had to answer for it. People are like, "Why do we have these, benefits? I'm at the company and I don't get to come into the office." So, like, look, like, there's a bunch of people doing jack shit, right? And, like, that's just the truth. And remote work and technology doesn't change the number of people doing jack shit. It just makes it harder to figure out. That is a business's problem, right? That's not an individual problem. If you're this great big business that's so smart and hires all the best people, then you should be able to figure out if people are doing jack shit or not. It's just true. And then if there's people that are really productive, like I personally feel a bit underemployed. Like, I could do way more. And like, there's a whole other side of the argument I will shut up, which is, oh, well, you can only do one thing as a business. You can only do one thing really well. Who on earth came up with that crap? Like maybe at some level where you've got venture-backed businesses that are executing at a really high level, individuals are not made to do that. And Daniel Epstein's great book, Range, I think taught that. So I'm excited for people to fall out of love with the 10,000 hour rule. And I think this is a fascinating debate. But I agree with you, Jay. I don't get a buzz out of that J1 guy. Like, I think it's funny. But like, overemployed to me is like, I got to work for 4 billionaire founders at once and was able to crush it for all 4 of them. Like, that's cool,
Mateo, I feel like you have thoughts here. Just given the fact that I feel like the creator industry in general is so heavily dependent on like folks doing things part-time before they could do things full-time. And the vast majority of creators probably get their start being quote unquote overemployed to some degree.
Yeah, you can tell I'm quiet on the audio because my audio is trash. I'm just trying to save any listeners from this pain. No, I do think it's interesting though, because you're right. Most creators start off being overemployed, trying to do like 15 different things at once. I think for me, high level, what I find interesting about everything is just how like different generations look at it, and especially with people today, like you were saying, Cornelius, with remote work, of like people really do have this mindset, at least most of the people I know, of like, who fucking cares if I can pull it off, and side hustles are good, and all of these different things. For me, if you have an employer where you have a contract saying like you can't work for competitors and you're working for competitors, then like, yeah, it's up to the employer to enforce it, but like I think that's up to the person to just do what they want. But as it pertains to like individuals and small businesses, I think being overemployed kind of like teaches you a lot of skills of like what the hell you just have to do sometimes. Of like, yeah, as a creator, sometimes you have to learn how to edit just well enough at first, and how to design just well enough at first, and how to produce. And in an ideal world, there'd be a more clear curriculum, go back to education, of how you can do the different passions that you want to do and monetize them quickly. But the reality is most people that, are small business owners or individuals working, they can't do that. So I don't like the mindset of like, overworking's cool, like watch me grind, Gary Vee, squeeze the orange. But I do think there's a lot of benefits depending on the situation of just saying like, hey, for a certain period of time, there's no easy path to do this, but you want to do it, or competition's hard, and sometimes you have to overwork to do that. Working 10 different jobs and flexing on it, yeah, I'm with Cornelius. The framing of like how you frame it is everything to me in that sense.
Yeah, I'll agree with that one. Like, hustle for the sake of hustle is pretty cringe. But I also, speaking of Twitter, Cornelius, there are often like these monthly Twitter conversations where somebody will tweet like, oh, like working on the weekend, grind don't stop. And then everybody will be like, oh, this is what's wrong with corporate culture today. Like, you don't need to work on the weekends in order to be successful. I've never worked more than 6 hours a day in my life. And it's like, okay, well, you're now on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where the people who arguably are going to get ahead in the industry are the ones who are putting in additional time, right? So it's more like, yes, there's the conversation around like work smarter, not harder, but there's also this conversation around like grinding with a purpose, right? Like not just grinding because I want to like flex it on social media, but grinding because I'm trying to reach a particular goal. And if your goal is like maximizing income, then maybe you should be overemployed. If your goal is like maximizing career progression, maybe you should be focusing on like the one thing really, really, really hard in order to take that next step. But I think it depends on the person.
Matt, do you want to dive into creator-led businesses at all?
I mean, with 9 minutes, here we go. I'm curious. I think it's a good bridge, Jay, of what you were saying before, too, with even just this concept of overworking and creators. I think, speaking of overworking, separate of just creators, I think you have a lot of small businesses, whether it's now in like the definition of creator is huge. I used to think that meant like you were on social media as an influencer, but like you can be a writer or have a podcast or, you know, have content on social, whatever it is, help brands, etc., etc. And I'm starting to see this like common pattern. Like, Jay, we've been in this space for a while of like in 2015, like the first creators were doing merch really well and everyone was like, yo, this is the thing. Like every creator needs merch. And then over the next 4 years, it's saturated to where like, I don't think I've ever met a creator with more than like 1 million followers that doesn't have a merch line. And it seems like in 2020, like start of COVID, give or take, there was like wave 2, which is like creators can build more businesses than just merch. Like let's ship products, specifically most of the time food, but sometimes with exception. And so you have all of these different huge creators now that I feel like CPG or just food are becoming like very like common items. I think of like Beast Burger, Feastables, Eric has a Pizzafy sauce, Nelk has Happy Dad Seltzer. Like this is just kind of becoming the thing. And I think I'm starting to see the writing on the wall of this like potential turning points of like, okay, well that's cool and it's still kind of really tied to your brand, but what if creators can also start businesses that aren't fully tied to their brand that still like generate a ton of revenue and can live outside of their, you know, content ecosystem per se? And that's something that's really interesting to me, and I'm just curious how you guys think about that as a concept of like, for any creator, when you're building a brand, how much of it needs to be tied to you, your brand, your content, versus just like standalone business, we have capital and can find the right operators to help bring this to life. And I'm curious if you guys have seen examples of, you know, creators already doing this, or if you think it's heading that way, or, you know, at the same time, my last thought would be, I always wonder, you hear the like 1,000 true fans dynamic a lot of like the creator economy middle class, which like as of today is bullshit in my opinion. It's a power law. Like algorithms, like the top 2% of YouTubers make like over 90% of the revenue. So I'm curious if you guys think with creator-led businesses, it's truly like this is the opening to a middle class, or it's like, no, this is just another great opportunity for the Mr. Beasts of the world to make hundreds of millions of dollars while like everyday people are going to struggle to actually find traction there. So that was loaded, but I'm very curious for your guys' thoughts.
Oh man. We should have a separate episode that is literally just this topic, because I feel like this goes into so many different directions and also touches on so many of the topics that we discussed like prior to this, right? My short answer to what you said, Mateo, is I think there will be a middle class as far as like these creators starting their own businesses, but like it will look very, very different than we would expect it to, right? It might not actually look like every individual creator starting an independent, like autonomous brand. But it might look like a lot more collaboration on these brands that like that creators are propping up. Specifically, there's this fantastic article that I read recently called Life After Lifestyle, and it sort of maps out the last decade of brand developments. It talks a little bit about how like the supply chain has essentially become an API for brands, where you have all these like white label CPG products and then brands that just like tack their name on it and like try to sell it. And what we're seeing now is that we're seeing like the next generation of this cultural development, where it's not just brands tacking themselves onto CPG products like you mentioned, but now it's brands actually in the business of creating culture. And specifically, the author gets into creating types of guy. So like Nelk Boys, you use as an example, is a really, really good example of this, where like you just know when you see a guy who's into Nelk Boys, like if he's holding the seltzer, you know exactly what the rest of his personality is, right? You know what clothes he's wearing, you know what classes he's taking, you know what frat he's in. There's just like a list of personality traits as a result of like associating yourself with that brand. I think creators more and more are going to be in the business of creating types of guy or embracing certain types of guy. And essentially all that means is like explicit cultural development, right? The products aren't just going to be monetized like CPG. The products are actually going to be intentionally crafted in order to like serve a specific like subculture, and also like to play a part in like crafting that subculture, right? So Mr. Beast Burger is like Mr. Beast is a big enough brand where he might be crafting a subculture in and of itself. But I think a lot of like these middle class creators who don't have the clout to like craft a subculture in and of themselves will like collaborate with each other, where it's like a certain type of guy might be buying Mateo's macaroni and Amaan's, Arm and Hammer and Cornelius's corn. And like there's this guy who is there's this guy who is buying like this specific combination of products. Yeah, I think that's what we'll see is like basically like this decentralized cultural development that comes from that comes from folks starting their own businesses.
Dude, that was so interesting. But now my only takeaway is to save the alliterations for Cornelius. To your point, though, just one thought that I think is funny is when you're saying when you see someone that's a fan of Nelk with like Happy Dad or as is it Happy Dad or Happy Camper? It's Happy Dad, right? Yeah, Happy Dad is their seltzer. You know, like what you're saying. You know what they're wearing. It's because they're also wearing Nelk merch. Shit does $70 million in revenue a year. Like that's its own culture in and of itself. So you're right. But someone can add more substance than me just roasting Jay's alliterations, please.
Yeah, no, I think it was beautiful, Jay, and I don't know. I'd love to see these guys build bolder products, but I also get Mr. Beast's argument. I watched the interview with Nelk, and he's like, yeah, I'll go into a Walmart, I'll be there for 30 minutes, I'll take 110 pictures. Like, I'd rather people buy my chocolate, bar as well. So I get that point. I just would love to see them get, more creative. Who are the crazy guys that just announced that ridiculous headquarters? The Dunk guys. Yeah, Dude Perfect. I think it's fascinating, man. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think what's interesting and kind of Mr. Beast brought this up is, YouTube is still indexing really young in terms of audience. And so by virtue of that, right, creators are probably going to build things that are like valuable to a young kid. And so I thought that was actually a really interesting point that, he brought up with Nelt Boys. It seems as if their audience index is a little bit older, which does feel like an interesting challenge for the platform. And so, yeah, I think it's amazing. But Jay, I would like to give you a few minutes on tokenized communities. I think, let's start as we mean to go on. Why don't you kind of give us your little wrap as the kind of crypto connoisseur, and then we can close.
Oh man, I feel like there's so much more meat left on that previous conversation. So I'll try to tie this in a bit. So quickly to like define a tokenized community, I think the definition that I've landed on is it is like broadly any organization or any network that is using a token as a form of organizing, and that token ends up providing two key sources of value. You have platformlessness. So because the token is like tracked on a blockchain or on an open database, and there's no one company that owns all of that data, I, as just like a random bystander, am able to like see who is a part of this community, who holds this token, like what else do they hold in this wallet? So like what other communities are they a part of? What interactions have they had with this community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not that like data lockdown of community development that we see with like a Patreon or even like on social media platforms, if you'd consider these communities. The other is that because these tokens are often like financialized assets, a lot of these communities come with like some sort of community treasury, right? So I purchase a token, X percentage of the revenue from that token goes into a community governed treasury. Again, like the transparency allows us to see like what that revenue split looks like and how much that the community is actually governing. And then this community now has a shared bank account that they're able to do whatever they want with for the community's development, depending on the mission, right? So if you're Mr. Beast community, it might be creating like Mr. Beast, like co-creating content with Mr. Beast, like remixing one of his videos. It might be creating like the Mr. Beast like junior burger instead of like, like the larger brand. Whatever the community wants to do, you can go a million different ways with it. So it's this transition from, user generated content to user generated everything, because now there's like money at the community's disposal to like proliferate the brand itself. Personally, I think that's really, really interesting and ties back to like this idea that Mateo was talking about creator-led businesses. Because again, I think unless you're a really, really big creator that could independently run a brand, what most of these creators are going to be doing is like leaning into like individual subcultures that they find themselves fitting into, and maybe some of their revenue is actually going to fund these tokenized communities. But as a result of that funding, they now have ownership in this much larger community of folks that like A, at the top level would be interested in their content, but B, at the bottom level will be co-creating with them in order to like merge their brand with these other brands that are related to the subculture, slash also like funding their own development as a creator, whether it's like new projects that you might want to put out that they wouldn't otherwise have funding for, a new company that they might want to co-start, et cetera, et cetera. So this combination of platformlessness and not being tied down to a particular company or database, and like actually giving these internet communities money to like have their creativity run wild, I think is this really interesting combination that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of. And right now it's sort of constricted just because the technology is still nascent to like this small class of crypto creators who are like comfortable with the technology. But I think in the next 2 years, it will like very slowly and then quickly make its way into like this mainstream creator class who are experimenting with this model.
Yeah, my first reaction is fascinating. I think my one kind of question, and we can attack this tonight or another time, is just, you know, I think brands are less excited about people remixing their stuff than maybe they let off. Like, yes, brands are reacting to the community, but as someone who runs a community, I'm not thrilled with the idea of someone taking that and running with it. Like, at the end of the day, like Soho House, YPO, these brands that have a community feel, they are highly, highly restrictive for a reason, right? You need to manage the experience. And I can't tell you like how many people have come into my community and said, let's start a book club, you know, and like never started the book club, or realized that actually it would have been a waste of resources. So I think it's a fascinating idea. I don't buy that like the community knows what's best for the community. I think that's part of the reason why you're up to into something in the first place. But yeah, I think it is fascinating, and I think it has implications for, you know, intellectual property. I know Mateo's in a space where there are lots of YouTubers now who are seeing their content on other platforms kind of being pirated on shorts or vice versa, and, you know, not being paid for it. So I'd love to know, Jihad, like how you would basically track that. Obviously, music is something we can talk about, probably the most developed space. But there's still millions of musicians that have not been paid on royalties for samples that they have or haven't used. So I think that's tricky to me. But yeah, I think my base feel is I don't think big curators are interested in people remixing their brand. I think buying a t-shirt that was designed by a big curator is like different than making your own and putting your logo on it. And the decentralization of that wealth is dangerous, you know, to a community builder, because there could be an uprising of sorts. I also don't live in crypto. Maybe this is why I don't live in crypto, but I can't see a world where that moves differently. It sounds like a bad episode of Succession as I think about it more. But I realize I'm very unsophisticated in this world.
I'll just answer the 2 points that Cornelius made. The first around IP. I agree that like I think the reason there was a lot of excitement around like big brands making the move into like crypto, right, and like using a lot of these technologies to do exactly what we just described. And I think the reason that didn't happen successfully is because like big brands have built all of their power and built their influence off of the basis that like they own the brand top to bottom, right? And they have full creative control. So it makes a lot less sense that like a Nike, which has attempted to like move into this world of crypto, is going to be the most successful like Web3 native brand. That is like almost definitely not going to be the case, right? It'll be like a truly Web3 native brand that started with these principles that then like builds up into like a much larger like size and influence. From an IP perspective, one thing that we're seeing folks adopt is CCO, which is just like a Creative Commons license. Basically says you could do whatever the hell you want with this, right? With absolutely no attribution. That is very scary for a lot of brand builders, but like the absolute level of creativity that comes out of that is something that's like really, really phenomenal, right? Because you do not have to ask any permission. But the visual like meme itself, or like the visual work of what you're doing, or even if you're a musician, like the sample that like this person is using or whatever is still there, right? People are still going to understand the provenance of like the work itself. So again, depends on what you are trying to accomplish, but I think this is like a new way of brand building that goes in complete opposition and has its own pros and cons relative to the old way. And then I think as far as like trusting the community to know what the community wants, I agree. I think a lot of times the community doesn't know, and what we've seen is that like the capital allocation in these communities looks a lot like venture bets, where it's really like the 1% to the 10% of bets that are made by the community that end up having like exponential returns to the community's growth and cultural relevance, and the other 90% either somebody flakes, like that money didn't get like used the way like we expected it to get used, maybe the project just completely flopped, and like people are putting in like various accountability measures, but at the end of the day you just have to accept the fact that like if we're trusting the community, we're trusting the community with not just like the successes but also the failures, and like creating more bureaucracy actually limits the like potential for that creativity to be unlocked in that 10% of bets that end up being successful.
Yeah, it sounds just like a university, with basically people endowing gifts and then effectively random professionals who happen to have that job for a period of time get to decide how that money is spent with no collective idea of what the organization is doing. But yeah, I think it's absolutely fucking fascinating. So thank you for bringing that, and I'm looking forward to learning more about that world, because just because I'm skeptical of it doesn't mean it can't happen, and I think that's what's most exciting. Well, look, gents, I'm going to wrap us here. Thank you all for joining us for episode 1. We will continue to get more entertaining and exciting. Mateo will figure out his audio. Sounds like I'm on introductions for next week, so I'm excited about that.
We're looking forward to it.
Until next time, gentlemen.